Have you ever felt your skin prickle with unease, even in a place you thought you knew well? Some instincts go beyond explanation, and when you're out in the wilderness, those instincts might just save your life. This story is a chilling reminder that what you can't see might be far more dangerous than what you can. The spring of 2011 had arrived in northern Wisconsin with a strange warmth, melting away the remnants of winter faster than anyone expected. The woods, still clinging to the dampness of thawing snow, seemed alive with the hum of new beginnings. My family, always eager to embrace the outdoors, saw this as the perfect opportunity for one of our cherished camping trips. This time, my parents had decided on a beach tucked deep into the forest, a remote, almost hidden spot we'd discovered years ago, but never stayed overnight at. It was the kind of place that felt both familiar and mysterious, its beauty undercut by an edge of unease that I couldn't quite explain. Our car rattled down the long, winding road that led to the beach, its tires kicking up small clouds of dust and gravel. The farther we drove, the fewer signs of civilization there were. The paved roads gave way to dirt paths, the occasional streetlights disappeared, and the dense forest began to close in around us. The towering trees formed a canopy so thick that the fading sunlight barely reached the ground, casting everything in a dim, otherworldly glow. I sat in the back seat, pressed against the window, watching the shadows shift and dance among the trees. My mom was in the passenger seat, flipping through a worn map. "We're almost there," she announced, though her voice carried an edge of uncertainty. My dad, ever the optimist, grinned and said, "See? I told you I remembered the way." Next to me, my younger sister was scribbling in her sketch pad, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was always drawing, animals, landscapes, sometimes strange, abstract shapes she couldn't quite explain. Parmesan, our golden retriever, sat between us, her head resting on my lap. Normally she'd be wagging her tail and trying to stick her nose out the window, but today she seemed subdued, her ears flicking every so often as though she were listening for something I couldn't hear. I tried to ignore the growing knot of unease in my stomach. It was probably just the isolation getting to me. After all, we were miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but endless trees. But there was something about the silence that felt off. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence you'd expect in the wilderness. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Finally, we arrived. The beach was just as I remembered it, a vast expanse of white sand stretching out to meet the dark, still waters of the lake. The trees bordered it on three sides, their shadows creeping across the sand as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Normally, there would be a few other families here, their laughter and chatter blending with the sounds of the waves. But tonight, the beach was empty. My dad parked the car near the tree line, stepping out and stretching his legs. "Looks like we've got the place to ourselves," he said cheerfully. My mom, however, didn't seem as thrilled. She stood next to the car, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a wary expression. "It's quiet," she said after a moment. "Too quiet." I shrugged off her comment and helped unload the car. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Parmesan stayed close to me as we unpacked, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Her usual excitement was noticeably absent. Instead, she seemed restless, her ears constantly swiveling toward the forest as if she were trying to pinpoint a sound just beyond our hearing. As the sun sank lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, we set up the tent near the edge of the beach. My dad hammered the stakes into the sand with practiced ease, while my mom laid out sleeping bags and organized the cooler. My sister wandered closer to the water, her sketchpad tucked under her arm. I stayed near the car, keeping an eye on Parmesan. She had started pacing, her tail held low, her movements jerky and nervous. "What's wrong, girl?" I asked, kneeling down to scratch behind her ears. She gave a low whine, her gaze fixed on the forest. I followed her line of sight but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the dense cluster of trees, their trunks bathed in the fading light. Still, the unease in my stomach grew. As we settled in for the evening, my dad lit a small campfire, its flames casting flickering shadows across the sand. The warmth and light should have been comforting, but instead, they seemed to amplify the darkness beyond its reach. My mom handed out sandwiches, and we sat in a loose circle around the fire, trying to shake off the eerie atmosphere. That's when I noticed the car. It was parked at the far end of the dirt road that led to the beach, its headlights barely visible through the trees. At first I thought it was just another family looking for a camping spot, but as the minutes passed and the car didn't move, a prickling sense of unease crept over me. "Hey, Dad," I said, nudging him with my elbow. "There's a car over there." He turned to look, his expression unreadable. "Probably just someone checking out the area," he said, though his tone lacked its usual confidence. My mom, however, wasn't convinced. "It's been sitting there for too long," she said, her voice low. "I don't like it." The car's engine roared to life, cutting through the stillness like a knife. My heart jumped, and Parmesan let out a sharp bark. The car moved, its headlights bouncing as it sped down the dirt road toward us. My dad stood up, his body tense, his eyes locked on the approaching vehicle. Parmesan growled, her fur bristling as she stepped in front of me. The car came to a sudden stop just a few feet away, its tires skidding in the sand. The driver's door opened and out stepped a man. He was tall and thin, his movements unsteady as though he were drunk, or something worse. His face was obscured by the shadows, but the glint of something metallic in his hand caught the light of our lantern. A knife. Time seemed to slow as he took a step forward, his boots crunching against the sand. My dad grabbed the camping mallet, positioning himself between us and the man. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering my dad's words. Then he smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that sent a shiver down my spine. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and slurred. "This is my spot. If this chilling introduction has you on edge, don't keep it to yourself. Like and share this story to let others experience the suspense. Who knows, they might have their own chilling tales to share." The man stood there, motionless except for the faint sway of his body. His face remained shadowed in the dim glow of our campfire, but the knife in his hand caught the light, its sharp blade reflecting an almost taunting glint. My dad, his usual jovial nature replaced by a tense resolve, tightened his grip on the camping mallet. His stance was protective, deliberate, a wall between us and this intruder. Parmesan's growl grew deeper, more guttural, vibrating through the air like a warning bell. "What do you want?" my dad asked, his voice calm but firm. The man tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. He took a step closer, the crunch of sand under his boots sounding impossibly loud in the otherwise silent night. "You shouldn't be here," he said slowly, his words slurred yet eerily deliberate. "This is my spot." My mom moved closer to my sister and me, her hand resting on my shoulder. I could feel her fingers trembling, though her face betrayed no fear. My sister clutched her sketchpad to her chest, her wide eyes flicking between the man and Parmesan, who had taken a defensive position in front of us, her body coiled and ready to strike. "We didn't know," my dad said, his tone measured. "We'll leave." The man smiled, a slow, unnerving grin that didn't reach his eyes. He shook his head. "No, you won't." The tension in the air was suffocating. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to hide, to do something other than stand there frozen in place. but my legs refused to move, rooted to the spot as if the sand beneath me had turned to cement. My mom's grip on my shoulder tightened, and I heard her whisper under her breath, "It's going to be okay." But I wasn't so sure. The man took another step forward, raising the knife slightly. Parmesan's growl turned into a snarl, her lips pulling back to reveal sharp gleaming teeth. I had never seen her like this before. She was always the gentle one, the dog who let toddlers pull her ears and wagged her tail, even when the mailman approached. But tonight, she was something else entirely, fierce, protective, and utterly unafraid. My dad took a step forward, raising the mallet slightly. "I said we'll leave," he repeated, his voice steady but louder now. "There's no need for this." The man laughed, a dry, humorless sound that sent chills down my spine. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, taking another step forward. "You don't get to leave." And then, everything happened at once. The man lunged forward, his knife gleaming as it caught the light of the campfire. Parmesan moved faster than I thought possible, a blur of golden fur and raw determination. She leapt at him, her jaws clamping down on his arm with a force that made him cry out in pain. The knife fell from his hand, landing in the sand with a dull thud. The scene was chaos. The man flailed, trying to shake Parmesan off, but she held on, her growls turning into snarls that echoed through the night. My dad lunged forward, kicking the knife farther out of reach and raising the mallet as a warning. My mom pulled my sister and me back toward the car, her voice urgent but calm. "Get in, now." I stumbled toward the car, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear anything else. My sister was already climbing into the back seat, her face pale and her hands trembling as she clutched her sketch pad. I turned back just in time to see the man finally manage to free himself from Parmesan's grip. He stumbled backward, clutching his arm, which now hung at an awkward angle. Blood dripped onto the sand, dark and glistening in the firelight. "Get in the car!" my dad shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. Parmesan hesitated for a moment, her body still tense and her gaze locked on the man. Then, with a sharp whistle from my dad, she turned and bolted toward us, leaping into the car just as my mom slammed the door shut. My dad didn't waste a second. He threw the mallet into the back seat, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The tires spun in the sand for a moment before catching traction, and then we were speeding down the dirt road, the beach and the man disappearing into the distance. Building the chase. The car was silent except for the sound of our heavy breathing and the hum of the engine. My dad's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. My mom sat beside him, her head turning every few seconds to glance out the rear window. In the back seat, my sister and I huddled together, Parmesan lying across our laps. Her body was still trembling slightly, her breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. "Is everyone okay?" my dad asked, his voice tight. No one answered at first. My mom finally nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "We're fine," she said, though it sounded more like she was trying to convince herself than anyone else. "What about you, girl?" I asked softly, running a hand over Parmesan's fur. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and alert, but filled with something I could only describe as determination. She gave a soft whine, then rested her head on my lap. For a while, it seemed like we were in the clear. The road ahead was empty, the dense forest on either side stretching into darkness, but the sense of unease refused to leave me. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves outside the car sounding louder than it should have, and then in the distance I saw them. Headlights. At first I thought it was just another car, maybe someone else heading home after a late night. But as the lights grew closer, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. The car wasn't just following the road. It was following us. Is that? My mom started, her voice trailing off. It's him, my dad said, his voice low and grim. Parmesan's instincts saved her family from immediate danger, but the night isn't over yet. What do you think will happen next? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts before moving on to the final part of this gripping tale. The headlights behind us were unmistakable. They moved with purpose, mimicking every turn we took, every swerve, and every acceleration. My dad clenched the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the dull glow of the dashboard. My mom sat rigid beside him, her head snapping back every few seconds to check the rear window. In the back seat, my sister and I huddled together, and Parmesan, still panting from her earlier heroics, was curled up at our feet. Her body, warm and steady, was the only thing grounding me in the chaos. He's following us, my mom finally said, breaking the tense silence. I know, my dad replied through gritted teeth. His voice, usually calm and steady, was sharp now, tinged with urgency. He pressed his foot harder on the gas pedal, and the car surged forward, the engine humming louder in protest. The dirt road ahead twisted and turned through the dense forest, the shadows of trees flickering across our windshield like ghosts trying to grab hold of us. I couldn't help but glance back, my breath hitching as I saw the headlights draw closer. They flickered momentarily as the car behind us hit a bump, but they never wavered, never faltered. Whoever was driving was determined, and that thought terrified me more than anything else. This wasn't just about scaring us. He was hunting us. Why is he doing this? My sister whispered, her voice trembling. My mom didn't answer, but the look she gave my dad was one of unspoken understanding. I could feel the tension between them, a silent conversation passing through their shared glances. My dad finally broke the silence. He doesn't want us to leave, he said simply, his voice low. But we're not stopping. The road narrowed further, the dirt giving way to gravel that crunched loudly under the tires. The car bounced and jolted with every pothole, and I clung to the edge of my seat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Parmesan let out a soft whine, sensing the tension in the air. The headlights behind us suddenly disappeared. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, we had lost him. My dad slowed slightly, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. Do you think... My mom started to ask, but before she could finish, the car behind us reappeared, its headlights blazing as it roared back onto the road. This time it was closer, too close. The driver gunned the engine, and the sound of it filled the night like a growl, predatory and unrelenting. He's trying to ram us, my dad shouted, jerking the wheel to avoid a collision. The car swerved sharply, nearly skidding off the road before regaining traction. My sister let out a small scream, clutching my arm so tightly it hurt. Parmesan barked sharply, her body tense and alert. Hold on, my dad yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. He took a sudden turn onto a smaller, unmarked road, the tires skidding slightly on the loose gravel. The headlights behind us hesitated for a moment before following, their beams cutting through the trees like searchlights. The new road was even rougher, barely more than a trail, with branches from overhanging trees scraping against the sides of the car. The sound was unnerving, like nails on a chalkboard, but my dad didn't slow down. He navigated the twists and turns with a precision born of desperation, his focus unshakable. But the car behind us wasn't giving up. It stayed on our tail, its headlights bouncing and flickering with every bump in the road. My dad pushed the car harder, the engine straining as we barreled through the forest. I could smell the faint tang of burning rubber, a sign that the tires were struggling to keep up with the relentless pace. After what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin, and the faint glow of lights appeared in the distance. It was a gas station, a small run-down building with a single flickering neon sign that read "Open." My dad didn't hesitate. He pulled into the lot, the tires screeching as he brought the car to a sudden stop near the pumps. "Stay in the car," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. My mom turned to face us, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "Lock the doors," she said firmly, and we obeyed without question. My dad stepped out, his eyes scanning the road behind us. The car that had been chasing us slowed as it approached the gas station, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife. It pulled into the lot but stopped at the far end, its engine idling. The driver didn't get out. He just sat there, the shadowy figure barely visible through the windshield. My dad stood his ground, the camping mallet still clutched in his hand. For a moment, it felt like time had frozen. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes every sound seem amplified. The hum of the gas station sign, the distant chirping of crickets, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then, without warning, the car backed up and sped away, its tires kicking up a cloud of dust as it disappeared down the road. My dad didn't move, his eyes fixed on the spot where the car had been. My mom rolled down the window slightly. "Is he gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now," my dad replied, his tone grim. We didn't stay to refuel. My dad climbed back into the car, and without a word, we pulled back onto the road. The lights of the gas station faded quickly in the rearview mirror, replaced once again by the oppressive darkness of the forest. Parmesan lay across my lap, her breathing finally beginning to slow. My sister leaned against me, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared out the window. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of gravel under the tires. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, the way he had smiled, the way he had followed us with such relentless determination. What did he want? Why had he chosen us? When we finally reached the main highway, the tension in the car began to ease, though none of us dared to relax completely. My dad kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his jaw tight and his eyes sharp. My mom reached over and placed a hand on his arm, a silent gesture of reassurance. Parmesan, who had been the hero of the night, finally drifted off to sleep, her body heavy against my legs. I stroked her fur absently, my mind racing with everything that had happened. She had saved us. There was no doubt about that. Without her, I didn't want to think about what might have happened. We arrived home just as the first rays of sunlight were breaking over the horizon. The familiar sight of our driveway, our house bathed in the soft glow of dawn, brought a wave of relief that was almost overwhelming. We stumbled inside, exhausted but grateful to be safe. In the days that followed, my mom reported the incident to the police. They took our statement seriously, especially after hearing about the man's erratic behavior and the knife he had brandished. But we never heard back. The man remained a mystery, a shadowy figure who had slipped away into the night. As for Parmesan, she became something of a legend in our family. My dad bought her a new collar, a sturdy leather one with a tag that read "Hero." She wore it proudly, her tail wagging every time someone mentioned her bravery. If this harrowing conclusion gave you chills, make sure to subscribe to Nightmare Narratives and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss our next spine-tingling tale.